Esther Chapter 1. Now it came about in the days of Ahasuerus, that is, the Ahasuerus who was ruling as king from India to Ethiopia, over 127 jurisdictional districts, that in those days, as King Ahasuerus was sitting upon his royal throne, which was in Shushan the castle, in the 3rd year of his reigning, he held a banquet for all his princes and his servants, the military force of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the jurisdictional districts before himself, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom, and the honor and the beauty of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days had come to the full, the king held a banquet for 7 days for all the people that were found in Shushan the castle, for the great as well as the small, in the courtyard of the garden of the king's palace. There were linen, fine cotton, and blue held fast in ropes of fine fabric, and wool dyed reddish-purple in silver rings, and pillars of marble, couches of gold and silver, upon a pavement of porphyry and marble and pearl and black marble. And there was a passing of wine to drink in gold vessels, and the vessels were different from one another, and the royal wine was in great quantity according to the means of the king. As regards the time of drinking according to the law, there was no one compelling, for that was the way the king had arranged for every great man of his household, to do according to the liking of each and every one. Also Vashti the queen herself held a banquet for the women at the royal house that belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the king's heart was in a merry mood with wine, he said to Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zetha, and Carcas, the 7 court officials that were ministering to the person of King Ahasuerus, to bring Vashti the queen in the royal headdress before the king, to show the peoples and the princes her loveliness, for she was beautiful in appearance. But Queen Vashti kept refusing to come at the king's word that was conveyed by means of the court officials. At this the king grew highly indignant, and his very rage flared up within him. And the king proceeded to say to the wise men having knowledge of the times, for in this way the king's matter came before all those versed in law and legal cases, and those closest to him were Karshina, Shetha, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, 7 princes of Persia and Media, having access to the king, and who were sitting first in the kingdom. According to law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the saying of King Ahasuerus by means of the court officials? To this Memucan said before the king and the princes, It is not against the king alone that Vashti the queen has done wrong, but against all the princes and against all the peoples that are in all the jurisdictional districts of King Ahasuerus. For the affair of the queen will go out to all the wives, so that they will despise their owners in their own eyes, when they say, King Ahasuerus himself said to bring in Vashti the queen before him, and she did not come in. And this day the princesses of Persia and Media, who have heard the affair of the queen, will talk to all the princes of the king, and there will be plenty of contempt and indignation. If to the king it does seem good, let a royal word go out from his person, and let it be written among the laws of Persia and Media, that it may not pass away, that Vashti may not come in before King Ahasuerus, and her royal dignity let the king give to a companion of hers, a woman better than she is. And the decree of the king that he will make must be heard in all his realm, for it is vast, and all the wives themselves will give honor to their owners, the great as well as the small. And the thing was pleasing in the eyes of the king and the princes, and the king proceeded to do according to the word of Memucan. So he sent written documents to all the king's jurisdictional districts, to each jurisdictional district in its own style of writing, and to each people in its own tongue, for every husband to be continually acting as prince in his own house, and speaking in the tongue of his own people. Chapter 2. After these things, when the rage of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti, and what she had done, and what had been decided against her. Then the king's attendants, his ministers, said, "Let them seek young women, virgins, beautiful in appearance for the king, and let the king appoint commissioners in all the jurisdictional districts of his realm, and let them collect together all the young women, virgins, beautiful in appearance at Shushan the castle, at the house of the women in charge of Hegai, the king's eunuch, the guardian of the women, and let there be a giving of their massages. And that young woman who seems pleasing in the king's eyes will be queen instead of Vashti." And the thing was pleasing in the king's eyes, and he proceeded to do that way. A certain man, a Jew, happened to be in Shushan the castle, and his name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the deported people who were taken into exile with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon took into exile. And he came to be the caretaker of Hadassah, that is, Esther, the daughter of his father's brother, for she had neither father nor mother, and the young woman was pretty in form and beautiful in appearance. And at the death of her father and her mother, Mordecai took her as his daughter. And it came about that when the king's word and his law were heard, and when many young women were collected together at Shushan the castle in charge of Hegai, then Esther was taken to the king's house in charge of Hegai, the guardian of the women. Now the young woman was pleasing in his eyes, so that she gained loving kindness before him, and he made haste to give her her massages and her appropriate food, and to give her 7 selected young women from the king's house, and he proceeded to transfer her and her young women to the best place of the house of the women. Esther had not told about her people or about her relatives, for Mordecai himself had laid the command upon her that she should not tell. And day after day Mordecai was walking before the courtyard of the house of the women to know of Esther's welfare and what was being done with her. And when the turn of each young woman arrived to go into King Ahasuerus, after it had happened to her according to the women's regulation for 12 months, for that was the way the days of their massage procedure were gradually fulfilled, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with balsam oil, and with the massages of the women, then on these conditions the young woman herself came into the king. Everything that she would mention would be given her, to come with her from the house of the women to the king's house. In the evening she herself came in, and in the morning she herself returned to the second house of the women in charge of Sheashgaz, the king's eunuch, the guardian of the concubines. She would not come in any more to the king unless the king had taken delight in her, and she had been called by name. And when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, whom he had taken as his daughter, arrived to come into the king, she did not request anything except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, the guardian of the women, proceeded to mention. All the while Esther was continually gaining favor in the eyes of everyone seeing her. Then Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus at his royal house in the 10th month, that is, the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king came to love Esther more than all the other women, so that she gained more favor and loving kindness before him than all the other virgins. And he proceeded to put the royal headdress upon her head, and make her queen instead of Vashti. And the king went on to hold a great banquet for all his princes and his servants, the banquet of Esther. And an amnesty for the jurisdictional districts he granted, and he kept giving presents according to the means of the king. Now when virgins were collected together a second time, Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate. Esther was not telling about her relatives and her people, just as Mordecai had laid the command upon her. And the saying of Mordecai Esther was performing, just as when she happened to be under care by him. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 court officials of the king, doorkeepers, became indignant, and kept seeking to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. And the thing came to be known to Mordecai, and he immediately told Esther the queen. In turn, Esther talked to the king in Mordecai's name. So the matter was sought out and eventually found out, and both of them got to be hanged on a stake, after which it was written in the book of the affairs of the days before the king. Chapter 3. After these things, King Ahasuerus magnified Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and proceeded to exalt him, and to put his throne above all the other princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate were bowing low, and prostrating themselves to Haman, for so the king had commanded respecting him. But as for Mordecai, he would neither bow low nor prostrate himself. And the king's servants who were in the king's gate began to say to Mordecai, "Why are you sidestepping the king's commandment?" And it came about that as they talked to him day by day, and he did not listen to them, then they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's affairs would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. Now Haman kept seeing that Mordecai was not bowing low and prostrating himself to him, and Haman became filled with rage. But it was despicable in his eyes to lay hand upon Mordecai alone, for they had told him about Mordecai's people. And Haman began seeking to annihilate all the Jews who were in all the realm of Ahasuerus, Mordecai's people. In the 1st month, that is, the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, someone cast pur, that is, the lot, before Haman from day to day and from month to month, to the 12th, that is, the month Adar. And Haman proceeded to say to King Ahasuerus, "There is one certain people scattered and separated among the peoples in all the jurisdictional districts of your realm, and their laws are different from all other peoples, and the king's own laws they are not performing, and for the king it is not appropriate to let them alone. If to the king it does seem good, let there be a writing that they be destroyed. And 10,000 silver talents I shall pay into the hands of those doing the work by bringing it into the king's treasury." At that the king removed his signet ring from his own hand, and gave it to Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the one showing hostility to the Jews. And the king went on to say to Haman, "The silver is given to you, also the people, to do with them according to what is good in your own eyes." The king's secretaries were then called in the 1st month on the 13th day of it, and writing went on according to all that Haman commanded the king's satraps and the governors who were over the different jurisdictional districts, and the princes of the different peoples of each jurisdictional district in its own style of writing, and each people in its own tongue. In the name of King Ahasuerus it was written, and it was sealed with the king's signet ring. And there was a sending of the letters by means of couriers to all the king's jurisdictional districts, to annihilate, to kill, and to destroy all the Jews, young man as well as old man, little ones and women, on one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month Adar, and to plunder the spoil of them. a copy of the writing to be given as law in all the different jurisdictional districts was being published to all the peoples, for them to become ready for this day. The couriers themselves went out, being moved to speed because of the king's word, and the law itself was given in Shushan the castle. As for the king and Haman, they sat down to drink, but as for the city of Shushan, it was in confusion. Chapter 4. And Mordecai himself got knowledge of everything that had been done. And Mordecai proceeded to rip his garments apart, and put on sackcloth and ashes, and go out into the middle of the city, and cry out with a loud and bitter outcry. Finally, he came as far as in front of the king's gate, for no one was to come into the king's gate in clothing of sackcloth. And in all the different jurisdictional districts, wherever the king's word and his law were reaching, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing. Sackcloth and ashes themselves came to be spread out as a couch for many. And Esther's young women and her eunuchs began to come in and tell her, and the queen was very much pained. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and to remove his sackcloth off him. And he did not accept them. At this, Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had made to attend upon her, and she proceeded to give him a command concerning Mordecai, to know what this meant, and what this was all about. So Hathach went out to Mordecai into the public square of the city that was before the king's gate. Then Mordecai told him about all the things that had befallen him, and the exact statement of the money that Haman had said to pay to the king's treasury against the Jews to destroy them, and a copy of the writing of the law that had been given in Shushan to have them annihilated he gave him to show Esther, and to tell her and to lay the command upon her to come into the king, and implore favor of him, and make request directly before him for her own people. Hathach now came in and told Esther Mordecai's words. Then Esther said to Hathach, and commanded him concerning Mordecai, All the king's servants and the people of the king's jurisdictional districts are aware that as regards any man or woman that comes into the king at the inner courtyard, who is not called, his one law is to have him put to death. Only in case the king holds out to him the golden scepter, he will also certainly stay alive. As for me, I have not been called to come into the king now for 30 days. And they proceeded to tell Mordecai the words of Esther. Then Mordecai said to reply to Esther, Do not imagine within your own soul that the king's household will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you are altogether silent at this time, relief and deliverance themselves will stand up for the Jews from another place. But as for you and your father's house, you people will perish. And who is there knowing whether it is for a time like this that you have attained to royal dignity? Accordingly Esther said to reply to Mordecai, Go, gather all the Jews that are to be found in Shushan, and fast in my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night and day. I too with my young women, I shall fast likewise. And upon that I shall come into the king, which is not according to the law, and in case I must perish, I must perish. At this Mordecai passed along, and proceeded to do according to all that Esther had laid in command upon him. Chapter 5. And it came about on the 3rd day, that Esther went dressing up royally. After which she took her stand in the inner courtyard of the king's house, opposite the king's house, while the king was sitting on his royal throne in the royal house, opposite the entrance of the house. And it came about that as soon as the king saw Esther the queen standing in the courtyard, she gained favor in his eyes, so that the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand, Esther now came near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, "What do you have, O Esther the queen, and what is your request? To the half of the kingship let it even be given to you." In turn Esther said, "If to the king it does seem good, let the king with Haman come today to the banquet that I have made for him." Accordingly the king said, "You men, have Haman act quickly on the word of Esther." Later the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had made. In time the king said to Esther during the banquet of wine, "What is your petition? Let it even be granted you. And what is your request? To the half of the kingship let it even be done." To this Esther answered and said, "My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the king's eyes, and if to the king it does seem good to grant my petition and to act on my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall hold for them tomorrow, and tomorrow I shall do according to the king's word." Consequently, Haman went out on that day joyful and merry of heart. But as soon as Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not rise and did not quake on account of him, Haman was immediately filled with rage against Mordecai. However, Haman kept control of himself and came into his house. Then he sent and had his friends and Zeresh his wife brought in, and Haman proceeded to declare to them the glory of his riches, and the large number of his sons, and everything with which the king had magnified him, and how he had exalted him over the princes and the servants of the king. And Haman went on to say, "What is more, Esther the queen brought in with the king to the banquet that she had made no one but me, and tomorrow also I am invited to her with the king. But all this, none of it suits me, as long as I am seeing Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate." At that Zeresh his wife and all his friends said to him, "Let them make a stake 50 cubits high. Then in the morning say to the king that they should hang Mordecai on it. Then go in with the king to the banquet joyful." So the thing seemed good before Haman, and he proceeded to have the stake made. Chapter 6. During that night the king's sleep fled. Therefore he said to bring the book of the records of the affairs of the times. Thus there came to be a reading of them before the king. At length there was found written what Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, 2 court officials of the king, doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. And then the king said, "What honor and great thing has been done to Mordecai for this?" To this the king's attendants, his ministers, said, "Nothing has been done with him." Later the king said, "Who is in the courtyard?" Now Haman himself had come into the outer courtyard of the king's house to say to the king to hang Mordecai on the stake that he had prepared for him. Accordingly the king's attendant said to him, "Here is Haman standing in the courtyard." So the king said, "Let him come in." When Haman came in, the king proceeded to say to him, "What is to be done to the man in whose honor the king himself has taken a delight?" At this Haman said in his heart, "To whom would the king take delight in rendering an honor more than me?" So Haman said to the king, "As for the man in whose honor the king himself has taken a delight, let them bring royal apparel with which the king does clothe himself, and a horse upon which the king does ride, and on the head of which the royal headdress has been put. And let there be a putting of the apparel and the horse into the charge of one of the king's noble princes, and they must clothe the man in whose honor the king himself has taken a delight, and they must make him ride on the horse in the public square of the city, and they must call out before him, "This is how it is done to the man in whose honor the king himself has taken a delight." At once the king said to Haman, "Quickly, take the apparel and the horse, just as you have said, and do that way to Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting in the king's gate. Do not let anything go unfulfilled of all that you have spoken." And Haman proceeded to take the apparel and the horse, and clothe Mordecai, and make him ride in the public square of the city, and call out before him, "This is how it is done to the man in whose honor the king himself has taken a delight." Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. As for Haman, he hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. And Haman went on to relate to Zeresh his wife and to all his friends everything that had befallen him. At that his wise men and Zeresh his wife said to him, "If it is from the seed of the Jews that Mordecai is, before whom you have started to fall, you will not prevail against him, but you will without fail fall before him." While they were yet speaking with him, the king's court officials themselves arrived and proceeded hastily to bring Haman to the banquet that Esther had made. Chapter 7. Then the king and Haman came in to banquet with Esther the queen. The king now said to Esther also on the second day during the banquet of wine, "What is your petition, O Esther the queen? Let it even be given to you. And what is your request? To the half of the kingship, let it even be done." At this Esther the queen answered and said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if to the king it does seem good, let there be given me my own soul at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be annihilated, killed, and destroyed. Now if we had been sold for mere men-slaves and for mere maidservants, I should have kept silent. But the distress is not appropriate when with damage to the king." King Ahasuerus now said, yes, he went on to say to Esther the queen, "Who is this? And just where is the one who has emboldened himself to do that way?" Then Esther said, "The man, the adversary and enemy, is this bad Haman." As for Haman, he became terrified because of the king and the queen. As for the king, he rose up in his rage from the banquet of wine to go to the garden of the palace. And Haman himself stood up to make request for his soul from Esther the queen, for he saw that bad had been determined against him by the king. And the king himself returned from the garden of the palace to the house of the wine banquet, and Haman was fallen upon the couch on which Esther was. Consequently the king said, "Is there also to be a raping of the queen, with me in the house?" The word itself went out of the king's mouth, and Haman's face they covered. Harbona, one of the court officials before the king, now said, "Also there is the stake that Haman made for Mordecai, who had spoken good concerning the king, standing in Haman's house, 50 cubits high." At that the king said, "You men, hang him on it." And they proceeded to hang Haman on the stake that he had prepared for Mordecai. And the king's rage itself subsided. Chapter 8. On that day King Ahasuerus gave to Esther the queen the house of Haman, the one showing hostility to the Jews. And Mordecai himself came in before the king, because Esther had told what he was to her. Then the king removed his signet ring that he had taken away from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther went on to place Mordecai over the house of Haman. Moreover, Esther spoke again before the king, and fell down before his feet, and wept, and implored favor of him to turn away the badness of Haman the Agagite, and his scheme that he had schemed against the Jews. Then the king held the golden scepter out to Esther, at which Esther rose and stood before the king. She now said, "If to the king it does seem good, and if I have found favor before him, and the thing is proper before the king, and I am good in his eyes, let it be written to undo the written documents, the scheme of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews that are in all the king's jurisdictional districts. For how can I bear it when I must look upon the calamity that will find my people? And how can I bear it when I must look upon the destruction of my relatives?" So King Ahasuerus said to Esther the queen and to Mordecai the Jew, "Look, the house of Haman I have given to Esther, and him they have hanged on the stake for the reason that he thrust out his hand against the Jews. And you yourselves write in behalf of the Jews according to what is good in your own eyes, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For a writing that is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, it is not possible to undo." Accordingly, the secretaries of the king were called at that time in the 3rd month, that is, the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day of it. And writing went on according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, and to the satraps and the governors and the princes of the jurisdictional districts that were from India to Ethiopia, 127 jurisdictional districts, to each jurisdictional district in its own style of writing, and to each people in its own tongue, and to the Jews in their own style of writing and in their own tongue. And he proceeded to write in the name of King Ahasuerus, and do the sealing with the king's signet ring, and send written documents by the hand of the couriers on horses, riding post-horses used in the royal service, sons of speedy mares, that the king granted to the Jews that were in all the different cities to congregate themselves, and stand for their souls, to annihilate and kill and destroy all the force of the people and jurisdictional district that were showing hostility to them, little ones and women, and to plunder their spoil, on the one day in all the jurisdictional districts of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar. A copy of the writing was to be given as law throughout all the different jurisdictional districts, published to all the peoples, that the Jews should become ready for this day to avenge themselves upon their enemies. The couriers themselves, riding post-horses used in the royal service, went forth, being urged forward and being moved with speed by the king's word, and the law itself was given out in Shushan the castle. As for Mordecai, he went forth from before the king in royal apparel of blue and linen, with a great crown of gold and a fine fabric cloak, even of wool dyed reddish-purple. And the city of Shushan itself cried out shrilly and was joyful. For the Jews there occurred light and rejoicing and exaltation and honor. And in all the different jurisdictional districts, and in all the different cities, wherever the word of the king and his law were reaching, there were rejoicing and exaltation for the Jews, a banquet and a good day. And many of the peoples of the land were declaring themselves Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen upon them. Chapter 9. And in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of it, when the king's word and his law came due to be performed on the day for which the enemies of the Jews had waited to domineer over them, there was even a turning to the contrary, in that the Jews themselves domineered over those hating them. The Jews congregated themselves in their cities in all the jurisdictional districts of King Ahasuerus, to lay hand on those seeking their injury, and not a man stood his ground before them, for the dread of them had fallen upon all the peoples. And all the princes of the jurisdictional districts, and the satraps, and the governors, and the doers of the business that belonged to the king, were assisting the Jews, for the dread of Mordecai had fallen upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame was traveling throughout all the jurisdictional districts, because the man Mordecai was steadily growing greater. And the Jews went striking down all their enemies with a slaughter by the sword and with a killing and destruction, And they went doing to those hating them according to their liking. And in Shushan the castle the Jews killed, and there was a destroying of 500 men. Also Parshandatha, and Dalphon, and Aspatha, and Poratha, and Adalia, and Aradatha, and Parmashta, and Arasai, and Aradai, and Vaisatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the one showing hostility to the Jews, they killed. But on the plunder they did not lay their hand. On that day the number of those killed in Shushan the castle came before the king. And the king proceeded to say to Esther the queen, In Shushan the castle the Jews have killed, and there has been a destroying of 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman. In the rest of the jurisdictional districts of the king, what have they done? And what is your petition? Let it even be given to you. And what is your further request? Let it even be done. Accordingly Esther said, If to the king it does seem good, let it be granted tomorrow also to the Jews that are in Shushan to do according to the law of today, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged upon the stake. So the king said for it to be done that way. Then a law was given out in Shushan, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. And the Jews that were in Shushan proceeded to congregate themselves also on the 14th day of the month Adar, and they got to kill in Shushan 300 men, but on the plunder they did not lay their hand. As for the rest of the Jews that were in the jurisdictional districts of the king, they congregated themselves, and there was a stand for their souls, and there was an avenging of themselves upon their enemies, and a killing among those hating them of 75,000. But on the plunder they did not lay their hand on the 13th day of the month Adar, and there was a rest on the 14th day of it, and there was a making of it a day of banqueting and of rejoicing. As for the Jews that were in Shushan, they congregated themselves on the 13th day of it, and on the 14th day of it, and there was a rest on the 15th day of it, and there was a making of it a day of banqueting and of rejoicing. That is why the country Jews inhabiting the cities of the outlying districts were making the 14th day of the month Adar a rejoicing and a banqueting and a good day and a sending of portions to one another. And Mordecai proceeded to write these things and sent written documents to all the Jews that were in all the jurisdictional districts of King Ahasuerus, the nearby and the distant ones, to impose upon them the obligation to be regularly holding the 14th day of the month Adar and the 15th day of it in each and every year, according to the days on which the Jews had rested from their enemies, and the month that was changed for them from grief to rejoicing, and from mourning to a good day, to hold them as days of banqueting and rejoicing, and sending of portions to one another, and of gifts to the poor people. And the Jews accepted what they had started to do, and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the one showing hostility to all the Jews, had himself schemed against the Jews to destroy them. And he had had Pur, that is the lot cast, to disquiet them and destroy them. But when Esther came in before the king, he said with the written document, Let his bad scheme that he has schemed against the Jews come back upon his own head. And they hanged him and his sons upon the stake. That is why they call these days Purim, by the name of the poor. That is why, according to all the words of this letter, and what they had seen as to this, and what had come upon them, the Jews impose and accepted upon themselves and upon their offspring, and upon all those joining themselves to them, that it should not pass away the obligation to be regularly holding these 2 days, according to what was written concerning them, and according to their appointed time in each and every year. And these days were to be remembered and held in each and every generation, each family, each jurisdictional district, and each city, and these days of Purim themselves should not pass away from the midst of the Jews, and the commemoration itself of them not come to an end among their offspring. And Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, And Mordecai the Jew proceeded to write with all forcefulness to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. Then he sent written documents to all the Jews in the 127 jurisdictional districts, the realm of Ahasuerus, in words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had imposed upon them, and just as they had imposed upon their own soul and upon their offspring, the matters of the fasts and their cry for aid. And the very saying of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written down in a book. Chapter 10. And King Ahasuerus proceeded to lay forced labor upon the land and the isles of the sea. As for all his energetic work and his mightiness, and the exact statement of Mordecai's greatness, with which the king magnified him, are they not written in the book of the affairs of the times of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and approved by the multitude of his brothers, working for the good of his people, and speaking peace to all their offspring.